Everyone in Millbrook knew Sarah Chen as the quiet librarian who couldn't lift a box of books without help. At 28, she weighed barely 100 pounds and had spent her entire life hearing the same words: too weak, too fragile, too delicate for the real world. Her own family worried she'd break if the wind blew too hard. When the spring floods hit their small town, turning familiar streets into rushing rivers, Sarah was evacuating the library when she heard the cry. A 7-year-old boy trapped on the roof of a submerged car, his leg clearly broken, the water rising fast. Without thinking, she dove in. For the next 2 hours she battled currents that had claimed grown men, carrying that injured child through 2 miles of treacherous floodwater to safety. But what drove someone everyone considered helpless to attempt the impossible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The children's reading corner of the Millbrook Public Library held a special kind of magic that Sarah Chen had spent 3 years perfecting. Soft rainbow cushions arranged in a perfect semicircle, picture books organized by color and size, and a hand-painted mural of friendly forest animals that she'd worked on during weekend hours. The reading corner represented everything Sarah loved about her job, creating safe spaces where young minds could explore worlds beyond their small town. Sarah moved through her morning routine with the quiet efficiency of someone who found deep satisfaction in small, precise tasks. At 28, she had the kind of gentle presence that made children gravitate toward her during story time, though adults often seemed to look right through her. Standing barely 5 feet tall and weighing 98 pounds, she had learned to navigate the world by making herself useful in ways that didn't require physical strength. "Sarah, honey, could you help me reach those books on the top shelf?" Miss Henderson called from the reference section, her voice carrying the automatic assumption that Sarah would need to find someone else to actually do the reaching. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson." Sarah wheeled over the step stool, climbed to the second step, and easily retrieved the volumes on local history. Her reach exceeded what most people expected, but they rarely noticed the contradiction between their assumptions and reality. The morning continued with familiar rhythms. Children arrived for the Tuesday story time, settling into the rainbow cushions with the eager anticipation of 7-year-olds who had learned that Miss Sarah always chose the most exciting adventures. Today's selection was The Little Engine That Could, a choice that would seem prophetic in retrospect. "I think I can, I think I can," the children chanted along as Sarah read, their voices filling the library with innocent determination. She watched their faces light up when the little engine succeeded, remembering her own childhood fascination with stories of unlikely heroes who accomplished impossible things. Tommy Morrison sat in the front row, his broken legs stretched out in a cast that his classmates had covered with colorful drawings. He'd been coming to story time every Tuesday since his bicycle accident 3 weeks ago, finding comfort in the routine while he waited for his leg to heal. Sarah had developed a special fondness for the serious-faced boy who always asked thoughtful questions about the character's motivations. "Miss Sarah," Tommy raised his hand after the story ended, "why did everyone think the little engine couldn't do it?" "She was an engine, just like the big one." "That's a very good question, Tommy. Sometimes people make judgments based on how things look on the outside without understanding what someone is truly capable of on the inside." The other children dispersed to select books for checkout, but Tommy lingered in the reading corner, running his fingers along the spines of picture books with the careful concentration of someone who took reading seriously. "My mom says you're the kindest person in Millbrook," Tommy said without looking up from the books. "She says you remember everyone's favorite stories and always order books that kids request, even if they're expensive." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. Recognition of her care and attention meant more than any acknowledgement of physical accomplishments ever could. This was her strength, the ability to see what people needed and provide it quietly without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. The afternoon brought the usual parade of regular patrons. Mr. Peterson researching genealogy, the Henderson twins working on a school project about local wildlife, and Mrs. Chang selecting large print novels for her book club. Sarah knew everyone's preferences, remembered their ongoing research projects, and maintained detailed notes about special requests. "Sarah dear, you're so thoughtful to remember that I prefer mysteries without too much violence," Mrs. Chang said, accepting Sarah's carefully curated selections. "Though I do worry about you walking home alone in the evenings. A young woman your size shouldn't be out after dark without protection." The comment stung more than it should have. Sarah had walked the same route home every evening for 3 years without incident, but people seemed determined to view her independence as evidence of dangerous naivety rather than capable self-sufficiency. As closing time approached, Sarah straightened the children's reading corner one final time, ensuring that tomorrow's young visitors would find the same welcoming space that had become her signature contribution to the library. The rainbow cushions held the impressions of small bodies. Picture books showed the gentle wear of eager hands, and the painted forest animals seemed to smile with satisfaction at another day of nurturing young imaginations. Standing in her carefully created sanctuary, Sarah felt the complex mixture of contentment and restlessness that had defined her adult life. She loved her work, treasured her connection to the community's children, and found genuine satisfaction in the quiet service she provided. But sometimes, in moments of perfect stillness, she wondered what else she might be capable of if given the chance to prove herself beyond the safe boundaries of the library's walls. The family portrait on Sarah's bedroom dresser captured a moment from 5 years ago, when her sister Jessica had graduated from law school. In the carefully posed photograph, Sarah appeared almost ghost-like beside her accomplished family, her father's protective arm around her shoulders, her mother's concerned smile, and Jessica radiating confidence in her graduation robes. Even in a simple family photo, Sarah looked like someone who needed looking after rather than someone capable of taking care of others. "Sarah, sweetie, are you eating enough?" Her mother's voice carried across the dinner table that evening, the same worry that had flavored family conversations for as long as Sarah could remember. "You look even thinner than last week." These Sunday dinners at her parents' house had become exercises in gentle interrogation disguised as family bonding. Sarah dutifully answered questions about her work, her health, her social life, and her future plans while her family exchanged meaningful glances that spoke volumes about their shared concerns. "The library job is perfect for you," her father said, carving the roast with methodical precision. "Safe environment, regular hours, not too physically demanding. You've found your niche." The word niche rankled more than Sarah cared to admit. It suggested limitation rather than choice, a settling for less rather than a deliberate selection of meaningful work. But expressing frustration with their protective instincts would only reinforce their belief that she was too sensitive for honest feedback. Jessica arrived 40 minutes late, sweeping into the dining room with the kinetic energy of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Her career as a corporate attorney had polished her natural confidence into something almost intimidating, even to family members who remembered her childhood vulnerabilities. Sorry, Jessica said, kissing their mother's cheek while simultaneously checking her phone. "Client emergency. You know how it is." Actually, Sarah didn't know how it was. Her work emerged from relationships built over years, problems solved through patient attention rather than aggressive advocacy. The library's emergencies involved lost books and broken printers, challenges that seemed trivial compared to Jessica's corporate battles. "Tell them about the partnership track, Jess," their mother prompted, pride radiating from every word. "Our daughter, the lawyer, making partner before she's 35. The conversation shifted to Jessica's achievements, cases won, clients impressed, colleagues who recognized her potential for leadership. Sarah contributed appropriate admiration while feeling the familiar weight of being the daughter who provided worry rather than pride. "What about you, Sarah?" Jessica asked during a brief pause in cataloging her professional victories. "Any exciting developments at the library? New romance novels to recommend?" The question wasn't malicious, but it reduced Sarah's work to a stereotype that ignored the complexity of serving a community's educational and cultural needs. Children learned to love reading in Sarah's storytime. Elderly patrons found companionship in her recommendations. Students discovered resources that opened new academic possibilities. But explaining these contributions would sound defensive, so Sarah simply smiled and mentioned a new children's author who had visited last month. After dinner, Jessica cornered Sarah in the kitchen while their parents watched the evening news. "Mom and Dad worry about you. You know, living alone, working in that quiet little job, not dating anyone seriously. They're afraid you're not building a real life for yourself." "What's not real about my life?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about her sister's definition of authenticity. "Come on, Sarah, you're 28 years old, and you live like someone's elderly aunt. No ambition, no challenges, no risks. When was the last time you did something that scared you? Something that pushed your limits?" The question hit deeper than Jessica probably intended. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had tested herself against something truly difficult, the last time she had attempted something with genuine possibility of failure. Her life had become a careful arrangement of manageable tasks and predictable outcomes. "I'm happy," Sarah said, though the words felt incomplete even as she spoke them. "Happy isn't enough," Jessica replied, her voice softening with genuine concern. "You're capable of so much more than you allow yourself to pursue. But you've let everyone convince you that you're fragile, including yourself." Driving home through Millbrook's quiet streets, Sarah found herself thinking about Jessica's challenge. The family portrait on her dresser would greet her return. That captured moment of being the smallest, most protected member of a family that measured success in bold achievements and public recognition. Perhaps Jessica was right. Perhaps Sarah had accepted limitations that were more about others' perceptions than her own actual capabilities. But changing those perceptions would require more than just internal recognition. It would demand actions that contradicted everything her family believed about her nature and potential. The antique brass barometer mounted beside the library's main desk had been a gift from the Historical Society when Sarah first started working there. Its mahogany base and ornate brass fittings reflected the building's 19th-century heritage, but Sarah had discovered that the instrument still provided remarkably accurate atmospheric readings. This morning the needle pointed towards stormy with an insistence that made her pause during her opening routine. Weather forecasters had been predicting spring flooding for 3 days, their warnings growing more urgent with each evening broadcast. The Millbrook River, swollen by unusual snowmelt from the mountains, threatened to exceed flood stage for the first time in 15 years. Yet the town's response remained characterized by the casual skepticism of people who had heard similar predictions prove false too many times. "They've been crying wolf about floods since I moved here," Mr. Peterson muttered, while checking out his weekly selection of Civil War histories. "Every spring, same story. Get people all worked up over nothing." Sarah watched the barometer needle tremble as atmospheric pressure continued dropping throughout the morning. Her grandfather had taught her to read weather signs during childhood summers at his farm. The behavior of birds, the quality of light, the way pressure changes felt in her sinuses. Today's signs all pointed toward the kind of severe weather that transformed familiar landscapes into dangerous territory. The children's story time proceeded normally, though Sarah noticed that several regular attendees were absent. Tommy Morrison arrived with his mother, who seemed more anxious than usual as she helped him navigate the library steps with his walking cast. "The doctor says another 2 weeks before this comes off," Tommy reported proudly, displaying the signatures and drawings that covered his cast like a colorful armor. "Then I can go swimming again. Mom promised we'd go to the lake this summer." His enthusiasm for returning to the water struck Sarah as both touching and ominous given the flooding predictions. She made a mental note to ensure that Tommy's family had received adequate warning about the potential dangers of rising water levels. After story time, Sarah found herself checking the barometer repeatedly. The needle had moved further towards stormy, and she could feel the atmospheric tension in her temples, a reliable predictor her grandfather had taught her to trust. Outside, the sky had taken on the greenish cast that often preceded severe weather in their region. Mayor Davidson arrived around noon for his weekly check-in, a gesture that had begun as campaign outreach but had evolved into genuine appreciation for the library's community role. Today, however, his usual cheerful demeanor seemed strained. "Sarah, I need to ask a favor," he said, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "We're setting up an emergency shelter at the high school, just as a precaution. I know it's short notice, but could the library serve as an auxiliary information center? People trust you, and they'll come here looking for updates if things get serious." The request both honored and worried Sarah. Being asked to serve as a community information hub reflected recognition of her reliability and judgment. But the fact that Mayor Davidson was making such preparations suggested that official concern exceeded what had been communicated to the public. "Of course," Sarah agreed. "What kind of information should I be prepared to share?" They spent 20 minutes reviewing evacuation routes, emergency shelter procedures, and communication protocols. The mayor's thorough preparation revealed that city officials took the flooding threat far more seriously than most residents realized. As afternoon approached, the library's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Regular patrons arrived, seeking information rather than books, clustering around Sarah's desk to ask questions about road closures and shelter availability. The barometer needle continued its downward drift, now pointing definitively toward the severe weather zone. Miss Chen stopped by to check on Raves for her book club meeting scheduled for Thursday evening. "Do you think we should cancel?" she asked, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone trying to balance social obligations with safety concerns. "Perhaps postpone until next week," Sarah suggested gently. The weather predictions seemed quite serious this time. By closing time, the barometer showed the lowest pressure reading Sarah had ever seen on the antique instrument. The brass needle pointed firmly towards stormy, and the atmospheric tension had developed into a genuine headache that felt like her skull was being compressed from all sides. Standing alone in the library as evening approached, Sarah found herself studying evacuation routes and emergency procedures with the careful attention of someone who suspected she might need to use such information soon. The barometer's warning seemed increasingly prophetic as pressure continued dropping and the western sky darkened with approaching storm clouds. The hand-drawn evacuation map taped to the library's main bulletin board had been created by Mayor Davidson's emergency committee 3 years ago. Its colored pencil routes and carefully lettered instructions representing the town's optimistic belief that disasters could be managed through proper planning. Red arrows indicated primary evacuation routes, blue lines showed secondary paths, and green dots marked emergency shelter highs. The map assumed that roads would remain passable, that bridges would hold, and that people would have sufficient time to reach designated safe zones. Sarah studied the map with growing concern as water levels rose faster than anyone had predicted. The morning had begun with routine flood preparations, sandbags around the library's foundation, electrical equipment moved to higher shelves, and important documents secured in waterproof containers. But by noon, the carefully planned evacuation routes were beginning to disappear beneath rapidly rising water. "Miss Sarah, why is there water in the parking lot?" Tommy Morrison asked, pressing his face against the library's front windows. His mother had brought him for their regular Tuesday visit, unaware that this would be anything other than another normal story time. "The river is fuller than usual," Sarah explained, helping Tommy navigate away from the windows as water began seeping under the front door. "We're going to need to leave soon and go somewhere safer." The evacuation map's neat categories couldn't account for the chaos developing outside. Main Street, marked as a primary evacuation route, had become a shallow river dotted with stalled cars. The bridge to the high school emergency shelter was underwater, its concrete railings barely visible above the rushing current. Secondary routes leading to higher ground were clogged with vehicles whose drivers had underestimated the flood's speed and intensity. Sarah's phone buzzed with text messages from Mayor Davidson: "Library evacuation immediate, water rising faster than predicted. Routes 1 and 3 compromised. Use Route 5 to Community Center." Route 5, marked in faded blue on the 3-year-old map, led through residential neighborhoods that were now reporting water in basements and ground floors. The Community Center, a squat brick building that had seemed perfectly adequate during planning meetings, was already overcrowded with evacuees from the Riverside district. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to leave now," Sarah said, gathering the emergency supplies she had prepared that morning. "The water is rising faster than expected." Tommy's mother looked confused and frightened as she surveyed the flooded parking lot. "But how do we get to the car? The water looks so deep." The evacuation map had assumed that people would drive to safety, but the reality outside the library windows revealed vehicles abandoned as their engines flooded and their owners sought higher ground on foot. The careful colored arrows meant nothing when the routes they indicated were impassable. Sarah made a quick decision that contradicted her usual deference to official procedures. "We're going to walk to the community center. It's only 6 blocks, and I know a route that stays on higher ground." Her knowledge of Millbrook's subtle topography came from 3 years of walking to work in all weather conditions. While others drove the flat, convenient routes marked on official maps, Sarah had discovered the network of slightly elevated streets and alleys that connected different parts of town through areas less prone to flooding. Leading Tommy and his mother through the library's back entrance, Sarah felt the strange exhilaration of making decisions based on direct observation rather than official guidance. The evacuation map remained taped to the bulletin board, its neat categories already obsolete, while Sarah navigated by instinct and intimate knowledge of the community she served. The water in the alley behind the library reached their ankles, cold and muddy with debris that spoke of the river's violent overflow. Tommy struggled with his walking cast, leaning heavily on both Sarah and his mother, as they made their way toward higher ground. "Miss Sarah, are we going to be okay?" Tommy asked, his voice small and worried. "Yes," Sarah answered with surprising certainty. "We're going to take care of each other, and we're going to be fine." As they climbed toward the residential area that would lead to the community center, Sarah realized that the evacuation map's greatest flaw was not its outdated routes or optimistic assumptions, but its fundamental premise that emergency response was something that happened to people rather than something they participated in creating. The neat arrows and designated shelters could not account for the improvised courage and community care that real disasters demanded. The waterlogged teddy bear floated past the community center steps like a small messenger of tragedy, its sodden brown fur and button eyes a stark reminder that somewhere in the floodwaters, a child had lost more than just a toy. Sarah watched it drift by as she helped Tommy and his mother reach the safety of the emergency shelter, the bear's silent passage stirring something deep in her chest, a recognition that innocence was drowning throughout Millbrook that afternoon. The community center buzzed with the controlled chaos of an emergency shelter. Red Cross volunteers distributed blankets and sandwiches while Mayor Davidson coordinated with emergency services through a crackling radio. Families clustered together on folding chairs, their faces reflecting the particular exhaustion that comes from watching familiar places transform into something dangerous and unrecognizable. Sarah had settled Tommy and his mother near the center's small kitchen when she heard it, a thin, desperate cry cutting through the general noise of adult conversation and official announcements. The sound made her freeze, every maternal instinct she possessed suddenly alert and focused. "Did you hear that?" she asked Mrs. Morrison, who was helping Tommy adjust his position to accommodate his cast. "Hear what?" Mrs. Morrison replied, distracted by the challenge of making her son comfortable in the crowded space. Sarah moved toward the community center's front windows, pressing her face against the glass to scan the flooded street beyond. The water had risen another foot since their arrival, transforming Elm Street into a turbulent river that carried debris, trash cans and pieces of people's lives toward the swollen Millbrook River. There on top of a partially submerged sedan, a small figure waved frantically. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that it was a child, probably 7 or 8 years old, trapped as water continued rising around the vehicle. The car sat in what had been the intersection of Elm and 3rd Street, now a churning confluence where two streams of floodwater merged with dangerous force. "There's a child out there," Sarah called to Mayor Davidson, who was deep in conversation with a state emergency coordinator. On top of a car in the intersection. Mayor Davidson squinted through the windows, then immediately reached for his radio. "Emergency services, we have a child stranded on a vehicle at Elm and 3rd. Can we get a rescue team to that location?" The response crackled back through static and disappointment. "All rescue teams deployed to priority areas. Water too dangerous for vehicle access. Helicopter rescue techs but ETA unknown due to weather conditions." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched the child. She could now see it was a boy with dark hair wearing what looked like a school t-shirt. His position on the car's roof was precarious, and the water was still rising. The vehicle rocked with each surge of current, debris striking its sides with impacts that sent vibrations through the floodwater. "How long for the helicopter?" Mayor Davidson pressed. "Could be hours. All aircraft grounded until wind conditions improve." "Hours." Sarah looked at the boy again, noting how he clutched the car's roof with both hands, how his position shifted each time a large piece of debris struck the vehicle. Hours might as well be forever, for a child whose strength was already being tested by fear and the physical demands of holding on against increasingly violent water. The teddy bear that had floated past earlier returned to her memory, some other child's beloved companion, torn away by water that showed no respect for the treasures that mattered most to small hearts. This boy on the car roof was someone's Tommy, someone's precious child whose bedtime stories and favorite books and daily hugs were all invested in his safe return. "I have to go get him," Sarah said, the words emerging before she had consciously decided to speak them. Mayor Davidson turned from his radio conversation. "What did you say?" "That boy, someone has to go get him, and it looks like there's no one else available." The mayor's expression shifted from distraction to alarm. "Sarah, absolutely not. The current is too strong. The debris too dangerous. You're not trained for water rescue and frankly," he paused, his eyes taking in her small frame with obvious concern. "Frankly, I'm too weak," Sarah finished for him. "Too small, too fragile, too inexperienced." "I've heard it all before." But as she spoke, Sarah felt something crystallizing inside her, a clarity she had never experienced before. This wasn't about proving herself to her family or contradicting other people's assumptions. This was about a child who needed help when no help was coming. Sarah's reading glasses caught the emergency shelter's fluorescent light as she placed them carefully on the community center steps, their wire frames glinting like a small promise that she would return to reclaim them. For 3 years, those glasses had been her constant companions, helping her navigate the fine print of library catalogs and the small text of children's picture books. Leaving them behind felt like abandoning her careful, measured life for something entirely unknown. "Sarah, you cannot be serious about this," Mayor Davidson said, following her toward the water's edge. "The liability alone if something happens to you, the city didn't ask me to do this," Sarah interrupted, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm making this choice as a private citizen who happens to know how to swim." The admission stopped Mayor Davidson mid-sentence. In 3 years of working at the library, Sarah had never mentioned swimming ability. Her reputation for physical fragility was so established that people simply assumed she avoided activities that required strength or athletic skill. The reality was more complex. Sarah had been a competitive swimmer in high school, earning varsity letters and regional recognition that her family had somehow forgotten in their concern about her general delicacy. She had stopped swimming competitively after a shoulder injury her senior year, but she had never stopped swimming entirely. The Millbrook Recreation Center pool had seen her 3 mornings a week for the past decade, though she swam during early hours when few people were around to witness her unexpected competence in the water. "I can swim," Sarah said simply, pulling off her cardigan and shoe. "I can swim very well, actually." Standing at the edge of the floodwater in her skirt and blouse, Sarah felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. Every assumption people had made about her limitations was about to be tested against the most unforgiving judge possible, a natural disaster that would respond only to actual capability, not to perceptions or good intention. The water was shockingly cold as Sarah waded in, her body immediately recognizing the familiar resistance and buoyancy that had once felt like home. Muscle memory from thousands of hours in pools awakened as she adjusted her stroke to account for the current's force and the debris floating around her. From the community center steps, she could hear voices calling her back, but they seemed distant and increasingly irrelevant. The boy on the car, she could see him more clearly now, was indeed about Tommy's age, with dark hair plastered to his head and a school shirt that identified him as a student from Millbrook Elementary. His grip on the car's roof looked increasingly desperate as the vehicle rocked with each surge of current. Swimming through floodwater proved dramatically different from lap swimming in a heated pool. The current fought her progress, pushing her downstream even as she angled toward the stranded vehicle. Debris ranged from harmless leaves and plastic bottles to dangerous chunks of wood and metal that could cause serious injury if they struck with sufficient force. But Sarah's stroke remained strong and controlled, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Her high school coach had praised her efficiency in the water, the ability to maintain speed while conserving energy, to read currents and adjust technique accordingly. Those skills, dormant for years but never lost, returned with the clarity of long-practiced expertise. Halfway to the car, Sarah paused to tread water and assess her progress. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, requiring constant adjustment to maintain her course toward the boy. Her clothing created additional drag, but not enough to prevent forward movement. Most importantly, her body felt strong and responsive, her cardiovascular fitness apparently better than anyone, including herself, had realized. The boy spotted her approach and his cries became more focused, more hopeful. "Help! Help me! I can't get down! I'm coming!" Sarah called back, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "Hold on tight. I'm almost there." The final 20 yards required every technique she remembered from competitive swimming. The current intensified near the intersection where 2 flood streams merged, creating eddies and cross-currents that could disorient even experienced swimmers. But Sarah read the water with instincts she had forgotten she possessed, using the current's force rather than fighting it directly. As she reached the submerged sedan, Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment that had nothing to do with reaching the boy, and everything to do with proving to herself more than anyone else that her body was capable of far more than her quiet life had required. The laminated school ID badge clipped to the boy's shirt read Tommy Morrison, Grade 2 in cheerful blue letters, the same Tommy who sat in Sarah's story time every Tuesday, who asked thoughtful questions about characters' motivations, whose mother worried about his recovery from the bicycle accident. The familiar name hit Sarah like a physical blow as she treaded water beside the submerged sedan, realizing that this wasn't just any child in need of rescue. This was her Tommy, the serious-faced boy who had become one of her favorite library visitors. "Tommy, it's Miss Sarah from the library," she called, reaching up to touch his ankle in reassurance. "I'm going to help you get down from there safely." Tommy's face transformed with recognition and relief. "Miss Sarah, how did you get here? The water is so scary and deep." Looking at Tommy's position on the car roof, Sarah quickly assessed the situation with the calm precision that had made her an effective librarian. His left leg, the one that had been in a cast, was bent at an awkward angle, suggesting that the cast had been damaged or removed during his escape to the car's roof. Blood seeped through his jeans, indicating some kind of injury, possibly from climbing onto the vehicle or from debris in the water. "Tommy, I need you to tell me exactly how you got here," Sarah said, maintaining the gentle but authoritative tone she used during story time when children needed to focus on important instructions. "The water came up really fast when me and Mom were walking to the store," Tommy explained, his voice shaking. "She told me to climb on the car and she would get help, but then the water got deeper and I couldn't see her anymore. My leg really hurts, Miss Sarah." Sarah's heart clenched at the image of Tommy's mother making the agonizing decision to leave her injured child in a position of relative safety while seeking help that might never arrive. The woman had trusted that Tommy could hold on long enough for rescue to come, not knowing that official emergency services were overwhelmed and unavailable. "You did exactly the right thing by climbing up here," Sarah told him, using the reassuring voice that had calmed countless frightened children over the years. "And your mom was smart to tell you to stay put. Now I'm going to help you get somewhere safe, but I need you to listen very carefully to what I tell you." Examining Tommy's injured leg from her position in the water, Sarah drew on first aid knowledge she had acquired during library safety training. The bleeding didn't appear arterial, but the leg clearly couldn't bear weight. Swimming to safety while supporting an injured child would require techniques she had never practiced, challenges that existed far beyond anything covered in her Red Cross certification courses. "Tommy, do you remember the story about the little engine that could? The one we read last Tuesday? I think I can, Tommy recited automatically, some of his fear giving way to the comfort of familiar routine. "That's exactly right. You're going to help me get us both to safety, but first I need to check your leg and figure out the best way to do this." Sarah had never performed a water rescue involving an injured person, but her competitive swimming background included extensive training in treading water, supporting others, and maintaining composure in challenging conditions. More importantly, her years of working with children had taught her to project calm confidence even when she felt uncertain, to break complex problems into manageable steps that small minds could follow. "I'm going to climb up beside you for just a minute," Sarah explained, pulling herself onto the car's slippery roof with more upper body strength than her slight frame suggested she possessed. "Then we're going to work together to get you into the water safely." Once on the roof beside Tommy, Sarah could see the full extent of his injuries and their situation. His leg showed signs of a serious gash that would need medical attention, but nothing that posed immediate life-threatening danger. The car itself was stable for now, but the water continued rising and the current was strong enough to move the vehicle if it became more buoyant. "Miss Sarah," Tommy said quietly, "are you sure you can carry me? You're not very big." The question carried no malice, only the practical concern of a 7-year-old who had learned to assess adult capabilities realistically. Sarah smiled, recognizing the echo of every doubt that had been expressed about her strength and endurance throughout her life. "Tommy, sometimes the smallest engines can pull the biggest loads. We're going to find out together what I'm really capable of." The splintered wooden post jutting from the floodwater like a broken tooth marked where the charming footbridge over Mill Creek had stood for 30 years. Sarah and Tommy had walked across that bridge dozens of times during their trips to the park after story time, but now only this jagged remnant remained, a stark reminder that the familiar world had become a treacherous landscape where even the most permanent fixtures could be swept away. Getting Tommy into the water had required every technique Sarah remembered from lifeguard training she had taken as a teenager. Supporting his injured leg while lowering him from the car roof, then positioning him for a rescue carry that would allow them both to breathe while she swam. Tommy's lightweight frame made the physical burden manageable, but his fear and pain created emotional challenges that demanded constant reassurance. "Remember, Tommy, you're my co-pilot," Sarah said as they began moving through the current. "Your job is to hold on tight and help me watch for debris. Can you do that?" "Yes, Miss Sarah," Tommy replied, his voice small but determined. Just like in the story about the brave little tugboat, the reference to another of their shared library books gave Sarah hope that Tommy's mind remained clear despite his injury and fear. Keeping him engaged and alert would be crucial for the long swim ahead, especially as they encountered obstacles that required quick thinking and coordination. The first quarter mile tested every assumption about Sarah's physical capabilities. Supporting Tommy while fighting the current demanded a completely different kind of swimming than her solitary morning laps. Her stroke had to be modified to keep Tommy's head above water while maintaining forward progress against a current that seemed determined to push them toward more dangerous areas downstream. Large pieces of debris created the most serious hazards. Chunks of dock torn from someone's waterfront property, sections of fence that could entangle unwary swimmers, and fragments of buildings that moved with the deceptive grace of icebergs. Sarah learned to read the water ahead, identifying debris fields and adjusting their course to avoid the worst concentrations. "Miss Sarah, look." Tommy pointed toward shore where a small crowd had gathered to follow their progress. "People are cheering for it." Sarah could see figures along the higher ground, some with phones raised to document their journey, others cupping hands around mouths to shout encouragement that was lost in the rushing water. The attention felt surreal. This was the same community that had spent 3 years viewing her as someone who needed help carrying books, now witnessing her attempt something that trained rescue workers had deemed too dangerous. The broken bridge post marked their first major milestone, but it also revealed how the landscape had changed in ways that made navigation more difficult. Familiar landmarks were submerged or destroyed, forcing Sarah to navigate by instinct and the general direction of higher ground. Her mental map of Millbrook streets became useless when those streets existed 3 feet underwater. "How much farther?" Tommy asked, his grip tightening around Sarah's neck as a particularly large piece of debris swept past them. "We're doing great," Sarah replied, though she was beginning to feel the strain in her shoulders and legs. "About halfway there. You're being so brave, Tommy. Your mom is going to be so proud." The mention of his mother sparked a conversation that helped pass the difficult middle section of their journey. Tommy described the terrifying moments when the water rose faster than anyone expected, how his mother had made the heartbreaking decision to put him on the car roof while she sought help. His account revealed the split-second timing that had separated survival from tragedy for dozens of families that day. "She told me to be brave like the characters in our library books," Tommy said. "She said Miss Sarah would understand why I had to be strong." The comment hit Sarah with unexpected force. Even in a moment of crisis, Tommy's mother had invoked Sarah's name as a source of comfort and strength. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman everyone considered too weak to handle life's challenges had become a symbol of resilience in a 7-year-old's imagination. As they passed the remains of familiar businesses now reduced to rooftops and signs emerging from the flood, Sarah felt her body finding a rhythm that incorporated Tommy's weight into her stroke technique. Her competitive swimming experience had included relay events and long-distance challenges, but nothing that compared to this test of endurance, determination, and the kind of strength that couldn't be measured in traditional athletic terms. The splintered bridge post fell behind them as they continued toward the community center, where Sarah's reading glasses waited on the steps like a promise that her old life would be there when she was ready to reclaim it. The red emergency megaphone in Mayor Davidson's hands crackled with static as he attempted to coordinate Sarah's rescue from the shoreline, its amplified voice cutting through the rush of floodwater with urgent instructions that couldn't possibly account for the reality of her situation. The device represented everything about emergency management that looked organized from a distance but dissolved into chaos when confronted with actual crisis. "Sarah, emergency services are en route," Mayor Davidson's voice boomed across the water. "Try to reach the Henderson property on Oak Street. They have a boat launching from there." Sarah could barely hear the instructions over the sound of rushing water and her own labored breathing. More importantly, the Henderson property was downstream from her current position, which would mean fighting the current to reach a boat that might or might not actually exist. Her competitive swimming instincts told her to maintain course toward the community center rather than waste energy chasing uncertain rescue options. Along the elevated sidewalks that still remained above water, crowds had gathered to witness something unprecedented in Millbrook's quiet history. Cell phones recorded every stroke as Sarah maintained her steady progress through debris-filled water, her small form barely visible except for the bright yellow of Tommy's school shirt marking their position. "That's the librarian," someone called. "Sarah Chen. I can't believe she's actually doing this." The recognition rippled through the growing crowd. People who had politely dismissed Sarah's capabilities for 3 years now watched her demonstrate strength and determination that contradicted every assumption they had made about her nature. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. How could someone they considered barely capable of lifting books be swimming 2 miles through flood conditions that had overwhelmed trained emergency responders? Miss Henderson, an elderly woman who had known Sarah since her first day at the library, stood at the edge of the water with tears streaming down her face. "I never knew," she said to no one in particular. "I never knew she was so strong." The comment captured something profound about small-town relationships and the way people could live in proximity for years without truly seeing each other's full capabilities. Sarah's quiet competence in the library had been noted and appreciated, but no one had extrapolated from her careful attention to detail and unflappable crisis management that she might possess physical courage and athletic ability. Jessica arrived at the scene just as Sarah and Tommy passed the halfway point of their journey. Sarah's sister pushed through the crowd with a determined efficiency that characterized her professional life, her expression cycling through disbelief, terror, and something approaching awe as she recognized that her fragile sister was attempting something that would challenge a trained athlete. "Someone needs to get in there and help her," Jessica announced, scanning the crowd for capable volunteers. "She can't possibly carry that child the entire distance." "Ma'am, the water conditions are too dangerous for untrained swimmers," responded a fire department officer who had arrived to monitor the situation. "We've already lost radio contact with 2 rescue teams. The current is too strong, and the debris makes it essentially impossible for anyone except maybe an Olympic-level swimmer." The comparison to Olympic-level ability struck Jessica as absurd until she really looked at her sister's form in the water. Sarah's stroke was efficient and controlled, her breathing steady despite the obvious fatigue, her progress consistent even against the flood's chaotic current. The swimming technique looked nothing like the casual paddling Jessica associated with recreational swimmers. This was the form of someone with serious training and competition experience. "Did you know Sarah could swim like that?" Jessica asked their parents, who had arrived shortly after hers. Their father shook his head slowly. "She swam in high school, but we never, she was always so—" He trailed off, unable to complete a sentence that would have described their daughter as anything other than capable of exactly what they were witnessing. Through the megaphone, Mayor Davidson continued broadcasting updates that bore little relationship to Sarah's actual situation. Emergency boats were supposedly launching, helicopter rescue was being coordinated, medical teams were standing by, but Sarah appeared to be navigating entirely by her own judgment, ignoring official instructions in favor of the route that made sense from her position in the water. The crowd's initial amazement gradually transformed into something more complex, a recognition that they had fundamentally misunderstood someone they thought they knew well. Sarah Chen, the quiet librarian who couldn't lift heavy books, was demonstrating that strength came in forms they had never bothered to investigate. The megaphone crackled again with another set of instructions that would prove irrelevant to Sarah's actual rescue plan, while the growing crowd of witnesses grappled with the realization that assumptions once formed could blind people to extraordinary capabilities hiding in plain sight. The mile marker stone that normally indicated the distance to the state highway now poked above the flood water like a small monument to determination, its weathered surface reading "Downtown 1 mile" in faded paint. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she paused to tread water and assess their progress. They had covered 1 mile of treacherous swimming, with another mile still ahead before they reached the safety of the community center. Tommy's grip around her neck had loosened as exhaustion overtook his initial adrenaline, making him both easier and more dangerous to carry. His lighter weight reduced the strain on Sarah's shoulders, but his decreased alertness meant she had to work harder to keep his head above water and ensure he remained conscious enough to help with their rescue. "Tommy, I need you to talk to me," Sarah said, adjusting her stroke to keep them both stable while she caught her breath. "Tell me about your favorite book. The one you check out every time you come to the library. The one about the whale." Tommy's voice was weaker than before but still clear enough to reassure Sarah that he remained coherent. "I like how he's different from all the other fish, but he's not sad about it anymore." The reference to the rainbow fish struck Sarah as particularly poignant given their current situation. Like the whale in Tommy's story, she was discovering that being different from others' expectations could be a source of strength rather than limitation. But the metaphor felt incomplete, as her body began signaling that the second mile would test reserves she wasn't certain she possessed. Her shoulders burned with the constant effort of modified swimming strokes. Her legs ached from fighting the current's attempts to push them downstream, and her lungs worked harder than they had since her most challenging high school competitions. The mile marker served as both encouragement for the distance covered and stark reminder of the challenge still ahead. "Miss Sarah, are you getting tired?" Tommy asked with the perceptiveness that had always made him one of her favorite library visitors. "A little," Sarah admitted, seeing no point in false reassurance. But remember what we learned from all those stories about heroes. They don't quit when things get hard. They find ways to keep going. The admission forced Sarah to confront a memory she had avoided for 10 years. The regional swimming championship, where she had led her event through 3/4 of the race, before her shoulder injury flared and forced her to accept defeat, just yards from victory. She had quit that day, choosing safety over the risk of permanent damage, and had never competed again. The parallel felt uncomfortably precise. Once again she was 3/4 through a challenging race, her body signaling distress, with safety tantalizingly close, but not guaranteed. The difference was that Tommy's life depended on her ability to push through whatever physical limitations her body tried to impose. "You know what helped me when I was learning to swim?" Sarah asked, partly to keep Tommy engaged, and partly to remind herself of resources she had forgotten she possessed. "I used to count my strokes and make each one perfect instead of worrying about how far I still had to go." It was a technique her high school coach had taught for distance events, breaking overwhelming challenges into manageable, repeatable actions. Instead of thinking about another mile of swimming, Sarah focused on the next 50 strokes, then the next 50 after that. The mile marker disappeared behind them as they resumed progress toward the community center. Sarah's stroke count became a meditation that helped manage both physical fatigue and the psychological weight of what she was attempting. 50 strokes of steady progress. 50 strokes of controlled breathing. 50 strokes of proving that her body was capable of more than anyone, including herself, had believed possible. "Miss Sarah," Tommy's voice was getting drowsier, a development that worried Sarah more than her own fatigue. "I'm right here, Tom. Keep talking to me. Will you still read stories to us when we get back to the library?" The question assumed a future that extended beyond their current crisis, a confidence that they would both survive this ordeal and return to the normal routines that had defined their relationship. Sarah felt a surge of determination that momentarily overwhelmed her physical exhaustion. "Every Tuesday," she promised, "and I'll have some new stories about courage to add to our collection." The mile marker stone marked more than just distance traveled. It represented the halfway point of any heroic journey, where initial enthusiasm gives way to the grinding test of endurance, where heroes discover whether their commitment runs deeper than their comfort. Sarah's waterlogged cell phone floated away from her pocket like a small symbol of surrender, its black screen reflecting nothing as it joined the debris field that marked their position 3/4 through the rescue journey. The device that had connected her to family, work, and the outside world was now useless, just another piece of technology defeated by the flood's relentless advance. In this moment, all external support systems had failed, leaving only her depleted reserves and whatever strength she could summon from sources she had never tested. The phone's loss coincided with the moment Sarah's body began sending unmistakable signals of distress. Her shoulders felt like they were separating from their sockets with each stroke. Her legs cramped from fighting the current for over an hour, and her lungs burned with the effort of maintaining controlled breathing while supporting Tommy's weight. Worse, she could feel her stroke technique deteriorating as fatigue overrode the muscle memory that had carried them this far. "Miss Sarah, why did we stop moving?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible above the rushing water. Sarah realized she had been treading water for several minutes, unconsciously delaying the moment when she would have to acknowledge that her strength was nearly gone. The community center remained visible in the distance, perhaps a 1/4 mile ahead, but it might as well have been on another continent, given the current state of her physical reserves. "Just catching my breath," Sarah managed, though they both knew it was more serious than that. Tommy's condition had also deteriorated. The blood from his leg injury was creating a small but persistent cloud in the water around them, and his grip had become increasingly limp as shock and exhaustion took their toll. Sarah understood, with crystalline clarity, that they were both reaching the limits of what human endurance could accomplish. A massive piece of debris, what looked like someone's entire garden shed, bore down on them with the inexorable force of the current. Sarah summoned enough energy to push them aside, but the effort left her gasping and disoriented. The near miss revealed how her reflexes had slowed and her ability to read the water's dangers had been compromised by fatigue. For the first time since entering the floodwater, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility of failure, not just the failure to complete the rescue, but the failure that would cost both their lives. Tommy's mother would lose her son, Sarah's family would lose their daughter, and the community would witness the tragic consequences of someone attempting something beyond their capabilities. The thought triggered a memory from her childhood that she had buried for 20 years. She was 8 years old, attempting to climb the tall oak tree in their backyard while her sister Jessica watched. Halfway up, fear and exhaustion had overwhelmed her determination, and she had frozen clinging to a branch while crying for help. Jessica had climbed up to rescue her, and their parents had added tree climbing to the list of activities that were too dangerous for delicate Sarah. "I don't want to be scared anymore," Tommy whispered, and Sarah realized he was slipping toward unconsciousness. The admission cut through Sarah's memories and self-doubt with the clarity of absolute necessity. Tommy's life depended on her ability to find reserves that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human endurance. This was no longer about proving her capabilities to skeptical observers or overcoming her own psychological limitations. This was about a 7-year-old boy who trusted her completely and had no other hope of survival. Sarah's grandfather had told her stories about farmers who lifted impossible weights when their children were trapped, about mothers who ran impossible distances when their babies were in danger, about ordinary people who discovered extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. She had always assumed those stories were exaggerations, but now she understood that human beings possessed capabilities that were accessed only when survival itself was at stake. "Tommy, I need you to help me one more time," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality of determination that seemed to come from someplace deeper than physical strength. "We're going to count together, and with each number we're going to get a little bit closer to being safe." The mathematical precision of counting provided structure for what had to happen next. A systematic application of will that would carry them through the final quarter mile even if her body believed such effort was impossible. Sarah understood now that the real test had never been about swimming ability or physical conditioning. It was about refusing to surrender when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. The church bell tower of St. Matthew's Episcopal rose above the floodwaters like a beacon of hope, its white steeple cutting through the gray afternoon sky with the promise that safety lay just ahead. Sarah had walked past that church hundreds of times during her 3 years in Millbrook, but she had never noticed how its tower served as a landmark visible from everywhere in town. Now, as she entered the final quarter mile of their desperate journey, the bell tower became her focal point, a destination that represented not just physical safety, but the completion of something that would fundamentally change how she understood her own capabilities. Tommy's breathing had become shallow and irregular, forcing Sarah to modify her stroke to ensure his airway remained clear. His injured leg trailed behind them, no longer responsive to his attempts at movement, but the bleeding had slowed to a manageable level. Most concerning was his decreased awareness. He responded to Sarah's voice but seemed to be drifting toward unconsciousness, despite her efforts to keep him engaged. "Tommy, look ahead," Sarah said, adjusting her grip to better support his head. "Do you see the church tower? That means we're almost home. The white tower." Tommy's voice was Beth's. A real whisper. "It looks like the lighthouse in the story about the lost ship." The reference to another of their shared library books gave Sarah hope that Tommy's mind remained clear even as his body struggled with injury and exhaustion. More importantly, it reminded her that their relationship had been built on stories of courage and perseverance, tales that had seemed like simple entertainment during peaceful Tuesday story times, but now revealed themselves as preparation for exactly this kind of test. Sarah's stroke technique had evolved throughout their journey from the efficient form of competitive swimming to something more primitive but sustainable, a rhythm that accommodated Tommy's weight while conserving enough energy to complete the distance. Her shoulders no longer sent signals of pain. They had moved beyond sensation into a realm of pure function, mechanical tools serving her will rather than her comfort. The water around the church showed signs of organization that had been absent from the chaotic currents they had navigated earlier. Emergency responders had established a staging area in the church parking lot, which sat on higher ground that remained above the flood level. Sarah could see boats, ambulances, and crowds of people preparing to receive them. "Miss Sarah," Tommy said, his voice stronger as he noticed the activity ahead, "are those people waiting for us?" "Yes, they are," Sarah replied, feeling a surge of energy that came from the proximity of success rather than any improvement in her physical condition. "Your mom is probably there, worried, sick, and waiting to give you the biggest hug of your life." The mention of his mother sparked a revival in Tommy's alertness. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, the 7-year-old began looking ahead with renewed interest, searching the crowd for the familiar figure who represented safety and love. The final 100 yards tested Sarah's ability to maintain controlled swimming while managing the growing excitement and relief that threatened to compromise her technique. The church tower loomed larger with each stroke, its solid presence promising an end to the ordeal that had stretched her beyond every limit she thought she possessed. Emergency responders in the water moved toward them with rescue equipment, but Sarah waved them off with a gesture that surprised everyone watching. After swimming nearly 2 miles through conditions that had defeated trained rescue teams, she was determined to complete the journey under her own power. The gesture wasn't about pride or stubbornness. It was about honoring the commitment she had made to Tommy and to herself when she first entered the floodwater. "Almost there, Tommy," Sarah said as they approached the improvised landing area that volunteers had constructed using boat ramps and floating docks. "You've been so brave. Your mom is going to be amazed when she hears about everything you did to help us get here safely." The church bell tower had guided them home, but Sarah understood that home meant something different now than it had when she left her reading glasses on the community center steps. She was returning not as the fragile librarian who needed protection from life's challenges, but as someone who had discovered reservoirs of strength and courage that would forever change how she moved through the world. The tower's bells began ringing as they reached the final approach to safety, whether by design or coincidence. Sarah couldn't tell, but the sound seemed to announce something more significant than their successful rescue. It proclaimed the birth of a new understanding about what human beings could accomplish when circumstances demanded their absolute best. The silver emergency blanket that paramedics wrapped around Tommy shimmered like armor in the afternoon light, its metallic surface reflecting the faces of everyone who had gathered to witness their arrival at the church landing area. The rescue blanket represented more than just medical protocol. It symbolized the completion of Sarah's heroic act, the moment when her 2-mile journey through floodwaters transformed from desperate attempt into undeniable success. Sarah's legs gave out the moment she reached shallow water where volunteers could take Tommy from her arms. The transition from supporting his weight in buoyant water to standing on solid ground revealed just how completely the rescue had depleted her physical reserves. She collapsed onto the boat ramp, her body shaking with exhaustion and the delayed reaction of adrenaline leaving her system. "Ma'am, we need to check you for injuries," a paramedic said, kneeling beside Sarah while his partner focused on Tommy's more obvious medical needs. "That was an incredible thing you just did, but we need to make sure you're okay." Sarah nodded weakly, unable to speak as she watched Tommy being loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the hospital. His color looked better now that he was out of the water, and he remained conscious enough to wave at her as the ambulance crew prepared to leave. "Miss Sarah," Tommy called, his voice carrying across the organized chaos of the rescue scene. "Will you visit me in the hospital? I want to tell everyone about how you saved me." The request brought tears to Sarah's eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that she had actually succeeded in something that everyone, including herself, had believed impossible. The quiet librarian who couldn't lift heavy books had just completed a rescue that trained emergency responders had deemed too dangerous to attempt. Tommy's mother arrived just as the ambulance was preparing to depart, her face cycling through relief, gratitude, and the kind of profound emotion that defies easy expression. She had spent 2 hours believing her son might die, and now she was witnessing his rescue by someone she had never imagined capable of such heroism. "Sarah," Mrs. Morrison said, kneeling beside the boat ramp where Sarah was still receiving medical attention. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how anyone could thank you for what you just did." The conversation was brief because both Tommy and Sarah needed immediate medical care, but Mrs. Morrison's words carried the weight of a mother's infinite gratitude. She had entrusted her child's life to someone she barely knew beyond casual library interactions, and that trust had been honored in the most extraordinary way possible. Mayor Davidson approached as Sarah was being helped into an ambulance for precautionary observation. His expression reflected the complex mixture of admiration and bewilderment that characterized everyone's response to witnessing Sarah's transformation from perceived fragility to demonstrated strength. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying genuine humility. "When you said you were going after that boy, I thought it was a mistake that would end in tragedy. I was wrong about what you're capable of, and I suspect I'm not the only one." The ride to Millbrook General Hospital passed in a blur of medical questions and gentle probing to assess any injuries Sarah might have sustained during the rescue. Her shoulders showed signs of strain, her legs were cramped from fighting the current, and her hands bore cuts from debris she didn't remember encountering. But none of the injuries were serious, just the inevitable toll of pushing her body beyond every previous limit. In the emergency room, Sarah found herself in the surreal position of being treated as a hero by medical staff who had known her only as the quiet woman who donated books to their pediatric ward. Nurses who had exchanged pleasantries with her during hospital visits now spoke to her with a mixture of respect and amazement that felt almost overwhelming. Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had treated Sarah for a minor concussion 2 years earlier, shook her head as she reviewed the examination results. "Sarah, Your physical condition is remarkable. Whatever training you've been doing has prepared you for exactly the kind of endurance challenge you just completed." The comment revealed something Sarah was only beginning to understand, that her years of early morning swimming, dismissed by others as gentle exercise suitable for someone of delicate constitution, had actually prepared her for this moment of crisis. Her body had been ready for heroism even when her confidence wasn't. The emergency blanket that had covered Tommy now covered her as well, its silver surface reflecting the hospital's fluorescent lights and the faces of people who were seeing Sarah Chen with completely new eyes. The plastic hospital bracelet around Sarah's wrist read, "Chen, Sarah, patient," in bold black letters, a strange reversal of her usual role as someone who provided care and assistance to others. For 3 years, she had been the person who helped elderly patrons find comfortable chairs, who guided children to age-appropriate books, who remembered everyone's preferences and anticipated their needs. Now she was the one lying in a hospital bed, accepting care from others while her body recovered from the most extraordinary physical effort of her life. Tommy occupied the bed across the hall, his injured leg elevated and properly treated for the first time since his bicycle accident had been complicated by the flood emergency. Through the open doors of their rooms, they could see each other and maintain the connection that had sustained them through their terrifying journey together. "Miss Sarah, the nurses told me you're famous now," Tommy called, his voice carrying the excitement of a 7-year-old who was beginning to understand that they had participated in something remarkable. "They said people are calling you a hero on the television and everything." The media attention had begun within hours of their rescue, though Sarah remained largely unaware of its scope. Local news crews had interviewed witnesses. Emergency responders shared their amazement at what they had observed, and cell phone videos of the rescue were being shared across social media platforms with increasing viral momentum. The quiet librarian who had lived in virtual anonymity was becoming the subject of regional and national news stories. Jessica arrived at the hospital that evening with an expression Sarah had never seen before, a mixture of pride, amazement, and something approaching awe. Her sister, who had built a successful career on confidence and aggressive advocacy, seemed genuinely humbled by witnessing capabilities she had never suspected Sarah possessed. "I called Mom and Dad," Jessica said, settling into the visitor's chair with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "They're driving up from the city tonight. Dad keeps saying he can't believe what he saw in the news footage." The conversation revealed how dramatically the rescue had altered family dynamics that had been established over decades. Sarah was no longer the fragile daughter who needed protection and careful management. She had demonstrated strength and courage that exceeded anything her accomplished sister had ever attempted, fundamentally shifting the balance of how they related to each other. "Jess, you asked me when was the last time I did something that scared me," Sarah said, her voice still hoarse from swallowing floodwater. "I think I can answer that question now." The comment sparked a conversation that was long overdue, an honest examination of how family assumptions had shaped Sarah's self-perception and limited her willingness to test her own capabilities. Jessica's challenge about not taking risks had been more prophetic than either of them realized at the time. Dr. Hayes stopped by during evening rounds to discuss Sarah's recovery timeline and address the constant stream of media requests for interviews. "Your physical condition is excellent," she reported, "but you've experienced significant trauma, both physical and psychological. You'll need time to process what you've accomplished." The observation struck Sarah as particularly insightful. The rescue had required every resource she possessed: physical strength, mental resilience, emotional courage, and a kind of determination she had never been forced to access before. Understanding and integrating that experience would take time and reflection. Tommy's mother visited before heading home to rest for the first time since the flood began. Her gratitude had evolved from the immediate relief of a mother whose child had been saved to a deeper appreciation for the extraordinary person who had made that salvation possible. "Sarah, I need you to know something," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of profound realization. "When I put Tommy on that car roof and told him to wait for help, I never imagined that help would come from someone who would risk everything to save him. You gave me back my son's life." As evening settled over the hospital, Sarah found herself in the strange position of being the patient rather than the caregiver, receiving attention rather than providing it. The hospital bracelet on her wrist represented a temporary identity that felt foreign after years of being defined by her service to others. But the bracelet also represented something else: recognition that even caregivers sometimes need care, that strength doesn't mean never requiring support, and that heroic acts extract a toll that must be acknowledged and honored through proper recovery. The newspaper headline spread across the front page of the Millbrook Daily Herald read "Local Librarian's Heroic Rescue Saves Child" in bold type that dominated the morning edition, representing how public perception could shift overnight from invisible competence to celebrated heroism. Sarah stared at the paper from her hospital bed, still struggling to reconcile the dramatic language with her own internal experience of simply doing what needed to be done when no one else was available to help. The accompanying photograph, captured by a bystander's cell lens, showed Sarah and Tommy in the water during the middle portion of their journey. Her stroke looked strong and controlled despite the obvious challenges of supporting an injured child through debris-filled floodwater. The image contradicted every assumption Millbrook residents had made about their quiet librarian's physical capabilities. 23 interview requests since yesterday, Dr. Hayes reported during morning rounds, holding a stack of business cards from news organizations ranging from local television stations to national morning shows. The hospital's media relations department is a bit overwhelmed. They've never dealt with anything like this level of interest. Sarah's rescue had captured public imagination in ways that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders. The story combined elements that resonated broadly: the unlikely hero who defied physical assumptions, the life-or-death rescue that succeeded against impossible odds, and the quiet courage that had been hiding beneath an unremarkable exterior for years. Miss Patterson, Sarah's elderly neighbor who had always worried about her safety walking alone after dark, arrived with flowers and an expression of profound bewilderment. "Sarah, dear, I feel like I need to apologize for something, but I'm not quite sure what. I've been telling people for 3 years that you needed looking after, and now everyone's calling you the bravest person in town." The comment captured the cognitive dissonance that many community members were experiencing. People who had offered to carry Sarah's groceries, who had worried about her living alone, who had assumed she needed protection from life's challenges, were now confronting evidence that their protective instincts had been misplaced. Mayor Davidson visited with news that the city council had voted unanimously to recognize Sarah's heroism with a formal commendation. "We're also creating a new position, Emergency Preparedness Coordinator," he explained. The job would involve training community members in water safety, organizing disaster response protocols, and serving as a liaison with regional emergency services. "We'd like you to consider accepting the role." The offer represented more than just employment. It was recognition that Sarah's demonstrated capabilities qualified her for responsibilities that required both technical expertise and the kind of calm leadership she had displayed during the crisis. The quiet librarian was being asked to become a public figure whose experience could benefit the entire community. Tommy's grandmother arrived from out of state that afternoon, having driven through the night to see her grandson and meet the woman who had saved his life. Her reaction to meeting Sarah revealed the same pattern that had characterized everyone's response: surprise at the disconnect between Sarah's appearance and her extraordinary accomplishments. "When Tommy's mother called to tell me what happened, I pictured someone different," the grandmother admitted. "Someone bigger, more athletic looking. I don't understand how someone your size could do what you did." The honest confusion in her voice reflected a broader challenge that Sarah was beginning to recognize. People's assumptions about physical capability were so strongly tied to appearance that witnessing her rescue created a kind of cognitive dissonance that required fundamental revision of their beliefs about strength and heroism. Jessica returned with a stack of job offers that had arrived at Sarah's apartment. Swimming programs wanted her as an instructor. Emergency services agencies offered training positions, and motivational speaking bureaus proposed lecture tours that would take her across the country sharing her story. "You could write your own ticket now," Jessica said, spreading the opportunities across Sarah's hospital bed table. Corporate retreat facilitator, wilderness survival instructor, athletic trainer for youth programs. Everyone wants to hire the woman who swam 2 miles through a flood to save a child. The offers were flattering and financially attractive, but they also felt disconnected from Sarah's actual interests and values. She had not performed the rescue to launch a new career or gain public recognition. She had acted out of immediate necessity when a child needed help and no other assistance was available. The newspaper headline would be framed and hung in the library where Sarah had worked quietly for 3 years, a permanent reminder that heroism could emerge from the most unexpected sources when circumstances demanded extraordinary response to human need. The bright blue swimming pool lane, ropes stretched across the Millbrook Recreation Center pool, like a boundary between Sarah's old life and her new role as the community's water safety instructor. 3 months after the rescue, She had returned to the same pool where she had swum solitary morning laps for years, but now the space buzzed with the voices of children and adults eager to learn from someone whose swimming ability had proven itself under the most challenging conditions possible. "Miss Sarah, show us again how you carried Tommy through the water," 8-year-old Maria requested, her voice carrying the mixture of excitement and reverence that characterized all the children who now attended Sarah's swimming and water safety classes. The question had become routine during Sarah's instruction sessions. Every class included requests to demonstrate the rescue techniques that had saved Tommy's life, though Sarah was careful to emphasize that her actions during the flood had been improvised responses to an emergency rather than recommended procedures for water rescue. "Remember, the most important thing about water safety is prevention," Sarah replied, settling into her teaching voice that had evolved from library story time to poolside instruction. "We learn these skills hoping we'll never need them, but knowing they're available if an emergency situation develops." The water safety program had grown beyond anyone's expectations since Sarah accepted the emergency preparedness coordinator position. Parents who had never considered swimming lessons essential now enrolled their children with the urgency of people who had witnessed how quickly familiar environments could become dangerous. Adults who had lived their entire lives as casual swimmers signed up for classes that would teach them to handle emergency situations with confidence and skill. Miss Chen attended every Tuesday evening adult session, having decided at age 67 that it was time to learn proper swimming technique. "I've lived near water my whole life," she explained to the class, "but I never learned to swim with the kind of strength that could help someone else if they needed rescue." Her comment reflected a shift in community thinking that extended beyond swimming ability to encompass broader questions about personal responsibility and mutual aid. Sarah's rescue had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could possess capabilities that made them valuable resources during emergencies, but only if they had taken the time to develop and maintain those skills. The recreation center had installed new safety equipment and emergency protocols partly in response to Sarah's recommendations. Pool lanes were marked for distance training. Emergency rescue equipment was positioned for quick access, and staff members had received additional training in water rescue techniques. The changes represented the community's commitment to being better prepared for future crises. Tommy attended every Saturday morning youth session, his leg fully healed and his enthusiasm for swimming infectious among his classmates. His near-drowning experience had not traumatized him away from water activities, but had instead sparked a passionate interest in learning everything he could about swimming, water safety, and emergency response. "Miss Sarah taught me that being scared is okay as long as you don't let being scared stop you from doing what needs to be done," Tommy explained to newer students, his 7-year-old wisdom carrying authority that impressed both children and adults. The relationship between Sarah and Tommy had evolved into something more complex than teacher and student. He had become her assistant instructor in many ways, helping demonstrate techniques and sharing his perspective as someone who had been rescued rather than someone who had performed a rescue. Their partnership in the pool served as a living reminder of what could be accomplished when people refused to accept limitations based on size, age, or appearance. Family dynamics continued their gradual evolution as well. Sarah's parents visited monthly now, their protective concern transformed into genuine pride and interest in her work. Jessica had begun taking swimming lessons herself, admitting that her sister's example had made her realize how many assumptions she had made about her own physical limitations. "I spent so many years thinking I was the strong sister," Jessica confided during one of her visits to Millbrook. "But you've shown me that I was confusing aggressive confidence with actual strength. What you did required a kind of courage I'm not sure I possess." The lane rope that divided the pool into sections for different skill levels had become a metaphor for Sarah's new understanding of human capability. Boundaries that seemed fixed and permanent could be crossed when circumstances demanded it, and people could discover reserves of strength and courage they had never been forced to access during ordinary life. Standing beside the pool where she now taught others to discover their own hidden capabilities, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of work that connected individual growth to community benefit. The hand-drawn thank you card on Sarah's desk showed a crayon drawing of 2 figures in blue water, one larger figure helping a smaller one reach a yellow building labeled safe. Tommy's artistic skills had improved considerably in the years since the rescue, but his message remained as heartfelt as ever. "Thank you, Miss Sarah, for teaching me I can be brave too. Love, Tommy." The card represented far more than a child's gratitude. It symbolized the lasting impact of courage on future generations and the way heroic acts ripple outward through communities and families. Exactly 1 year after the flood, Sarah stood in the renovated children's section of the Millbrook Public Library, watching Tommy demonstrate proper water safety techniques to a group of younger children during the weekly Heroes in Our Community storytime. The program had evolved from traditional fairy tales to real-life accounts of local people who had shown extraordinary courage, with Tommy serving as both narrator and living example of resilience. "The most important thing Miss Sarah taught me," Tommy explained to his captivated audience, "is that being small doesn't mean being weak. And being scared doesn't mean being cowardly. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give help when someone else needs it." His words carried the wisdom of a child who had experienced genuine terror and emerged with deeper understanding of both vulnerability and strength. The bicycle accident that had initially seemed like simple misfortune had become the catalyst for a friendship that demonstrated how crisis could reveal unexpected sources of courage and community support. The library itself had been transformed in ways that reflected the community's evolving understanding of emergency preparedness and mutual aid. Sarah's old reading corner now included books about water safety, emergency response, and real-life heroes whose stories inspired children to think about their own potential for courage. The collection balanced adventure stories with practical guides that could help young readers develop skills they might someday need to help themselves or others. Miss A. Morrison arrived to pick up Tommy after story time, her relationship with Sarah having deepened into genuine friendship based on shared experience that went beyond the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. "Tommy's been working on something special for today," she said, settling into one of the child-sized chairs that had once seemed too large for Sarah's slight frame. Tommy retrieved a wrapped package from his backpack and presented it to Sarah with the solemnity of someone offering a gift of profound significance. Inside was a framed photograph taken during one of their swimming lessons, both of them in the pool, Tommy's technique showing the improvement that had come from months of dedicated practice, Sarah's expression reflecting the quiet satisfaction of effective teaching. "I wanted you to have this because it shows both of us doing something we're good at," Tommy explained. "You're good at helping people learn to be strong, and I'm good at learning from you." The photograph would join the collection of mementos on Sarah's desk, the newspaper headline from the day after the rescue, letters from children who had heard her story and been inspired to take swimming lessons, and certificates recognizing her contributions to community emergency preparedness. But Tommy's gift felt different because it represented ongoing relationship rather than historical achievement. As the afternoon wound down and the library returned to its familiar rhythm of quiet activity, Sarah reflected on the ways her life had changed since that spring morning, when floodwaters transformed Millbrook's peaceful streets into dangerous territory. The rescue had lasted only 2 hours, but its effects continued spreading through the community like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Children who might never have learned to swim now possessed skills that could save their own lives or the lives of others. Adults who had assumed they were too old or too out of shape to develop new capabilities had discovered reserves of strength and determination they hadn't known they possessed. Families had honest conversations about physical limitations and hidden abilities that led to deeper understanding and more authentic relationships. Sarah's own transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. The quiet librarian who had once accepted others' assumptions about her limitations now served as emergency preparedness coordinator, swimming instructor, and informal community leader, whose opinion was sought on matters ranging from water safety to disaster response planning. But the most meaningful change was captured in Tommy's thank you card, the understanding that courage was not a fixed trait possessed by some people and lacking in others, but a capacity that could be developed, demonstrated, and shared. Every Tuesday storytime, every swimming lesson, every conversation about emergency preparedness planted seeds that might someday bloom into heroic action when circumstances demanded it. Standing in the library, where her journey had begun, surrounded by books that celebrated human courage in all its forms, Sarah understood that her rescue of Tommy had been just the beginning of a larger story about discovering strength, inspiring others, and creating communities where ordinary people were prepared to do extraordinary things when called upon by necessity and love.